The ship had been left to die in a slow orbit around a dead star, and the salvage crew found it singing to itself in a language no living thing remembered. That was the first thing the records would never explain. Shipwright Aun Rasal of the Meridian Rot read the human report 3 times, and 3 times it told him the same impossible thing. The wreck had been logged as a failure. It had been a failure for 900 years. Then a handful of humans climbed inside it, and within 4 years it was the strongest warship any species had ever set against the Black. Aun was old. He had built and broken more hulls than he could count, and he had stopped believing in miracles long before his crest went gray. So he did not believe this one. He sat in his survey cradle aboard the Meridian flagship, and he told himself the report was a lie. It was not a lie. That was the whole trouble. He had been a shipwright for 240 years, which was a long life even for his kind. He had seen the Empire at the height of its hunger, when a single meridian sweep could swallow 11 worlds in a season, and the gray hulls rose from the dissolved seas faster than the scribes could name them. He had stood in the growing vats and watched a dreadnought knit itself together out of a drowned planet, and he had believed, the way you believe in the floor under your feet, that nothing in the dark could stand against a thing that healed every wound and ate every enemy. That belief had been the air he breathed for 240 years. The human report was poisoning that air, line by plain line, and Aun could not stop reading it. The Meridian Rot did not build ships the way other species did. They grew them. The rot was a contaminant, a living gray bloom that ate metal and stone and bone and turned it all into more of itself, and the great hulls of the Meridian fleet were not welded or cast. They were infected. A seed of the rot was placed in a captured world, and the world dissolved, and from the gray sea rose a ship that healed its own wounds and digested its own dead. For 30,000 years this had made the Meridian unstoppable. You could not sink what regrew. You could not starve what ate everything. But the rot was old now, and old things forget how to live. Aun knew the secret no junior shipwright was allowed to know. The bloom was failing. The great gray hulls were growing slower, thinner, sicker. They healed their wounds, but the new flesh came back wrong, brittle, streaked with dead lines that would not carry power. A Meridian dreadnought launched today was weaker than one launched 1,000 years before, and no shipwright in the fleet knew how to stop the decline. They only knew how to hide it. Aun had spent 40 years trying to find the cause. He had cut samples from 1,000 hulls, young and old, healthy and sick. He had traced the dead brown lines down to the smallest grain of the bloom, looking for the rot inside the rot, the thing that was killing the thing that killed everything. He had found nothing he could fix. The bloom was simply tired. It had eaten for 30,000 years, and somewhere in all that eating it had forgotten the trick of making itself new, and now every generation of hulls came out a little more dead than the last. It was like watching a great old animal go gray, except that the animal was an empire, and when it died it would take 1,000 conquered worlds down with it into the dark. The High Command knew. They had known for centuries, and their answer had never once been to ask why the bloom was dying. Their answer was always to eat faster, conquer harder, drown the sickness in fresh worlds. It had never occurred to a single one of them that a thing which only knows how to consume might be sick precisely because it only knows how to consume. That thought belonged to someone else entirely, and Aun had not met her yet, though he was reading her log. So they conquered faster. They ate worlds faster, to feed the hungry bloom, to drown the sickness in fresh metal, and it was on one such hungry sweep, far past the edge of the charted dark, that the Meridian scouts found the human wreck. They almost did not bother to log it. It was not a Meridian hull. It was not human either, not at first. It was older than both, a vast dead thing of black alloy and dark glass, 11 kilometers from prow to stern, hanging in the cold with every light gone out. The scouts ran their seeds along its skin, and the seeds died. The rot would not eat it. That alone should have been a warning, but the scouts were tired and the hull was clearly dead, so they marked it derelict, threat level nothing, and moved on. Aun had read the scout log too. It was a small thing, a routine sweep entry, The kind of note a tired crew makes 1,000 times. But knowing what he knew now, he found it terrible. The scouts had written that the seeds died on the hull, and they did not stop to ask why. They had written that the alloy was unknown to their catalogs, and they did not stop to wonder what people had made it. They had found, drifting in the cold, the one ship in the galaxy built specifically to kill the Meridian rot, and they had glanced at it, shrugged, and flown on to go eat another world. That was the Empire in one entry. So hungry it could not see a warning, even when the warning was 11 kilometers long. The humans came for it 8 months later. Aun had the human salvage logs now, pulled from a courier the Meridian had taken in a raid, and he read them in the original simple human script, slow and careful, the way a man reads the will of someone he hated and is starting to fear. The salvage team had 6 members. 6, against 11 kilometers of dead alien ship that had defeated an entire conquering empire just by being too strange to digest. Their lead was a woman named Halden Brew. The logs called her a salvage engineer, which Aun understood to mean a worker, not a warrior, not a captain, not a noble of any human house. She fixed broken things for a living. She had spent 20 years crawling through dead hulls in the human frontier, stripping them for parts, and she wrote in her log the way she must have talked, flat and dry and without one wasted word. The other 5 were the same kind of people. There was a man named Oster who ran the cutting tools and could open any hatch ever made. There was a woman named Pell who knew power systems, who could look at a cold core and tell you why it had stopped. There were 2 cousins, the Vane brothers, who hauled and carried and never complained. And there was a quiet one named Sib, who kept the air running and the water clean, the one nobody noticed, until the day everybody would have died without him. 6 workers in a beaten salvage tug, with no warship, no fleet, no orders from any government, no reason to be there at all, except that there was a dead hull in the dark, and somebody had to look at it. Aun, who had commanded growing fleets of 10,000, found himself studying these 6 names the way a scholar studies a sacred text. He could not understand them yet. He would. He had to keep reminding himself, as he read, that these were not soldiers. The Meridian had a category for soldiers, a place in its understanding for the warriors of other species, the ones who came at the bloom with fleets and fire. Soldiers, the Meridian understood. Soldiers, the Meridian had eaten by the million. But the records called these 6 nothing of the kind. They were tradespeople, the lowest sort by Meridian reckoning, the kind of people an empire of conquest does not even bother to count. On a Meridian world they would have been the first dissolved, because they made nothing the bloom valued, commanded nothing, ruled no one. And it was these, precisely these, the uncounted and the unranked, who had walked into the one weapon in the galaxy that could end the rot and brought it back to life. Aun did not know yet why that was. By the end, he would understand that it was not an accident. The builders had set their test for a reason. The hands that fix are not the hands that rule, and they had wanted, above all, to be sure that their ship never again belonged to anything that ruled. The first entry was 4 words long. It read, "This one isn't dead." Aun set the log down. Outside the survey cradle, the gray flesh of the Meridian flagship pulsed and shivered, healing a hull breach from the last battle, and the new growth came back streaked with the dead brown lines that meant the ship was a little weaker than it had been yesterday. He watched it for a long while. Then he picked the log back up, because he had to know. He had to know how a worker and 5 tired humans took a corpse the size of a mountain and turned it into the thing that broke the Meridian rot forever. The wreck had a name, it turned out. The humans found it carved in a script even they could not read, 100 meters tall along the prow, and Halden Brew's translation software guessed at it for a week before giving up. So the humans named it themselves. They did not name it for a god or a hero. They named it for what it was doing when they found it. Still humming. That was the name. Still humming. A dead ship 11 kilometers long, abandoned by something gone extinct, and the humans climbed inside and found that deep in its black heart, 1 fusion core out of 100 was still lit, still turning, still feeding a thin trickle of power to a hull that had been waiting 900 years for someone to come home. Halden Brew did not see a wreck. She saw a job. The Meridian, when they finally understood what was happening, sent their best to stop it. They sent fleets. They sent the devouring choir, 60 hulls of living gray that had eaten 11 civilizations between them. They sent the Hollow Wind, a plague ship that could turn a planet's whole population to bloom in 9 days. They sent everything the dying empire had left, and Aun watched the reports come back, and the reports stopped coming back, and that was how he knew. The humans had done it. The worker had done it. She had taken the galaxy's most famous failure and made it into the galaxy's most powerful warship, and the Meridian Rot, 30,000 years old, had met the one hull it could not eat, and the one species that would not stop fixing it. Aun Rasal was the last shipwright of a dying empire, and he understood now that he was reading its obituary. He turned to the second entry. He wanted to understand the woman who had written it. He wanted to know what the humans had seen in a corpse that his entire empire had missed. He would understand, and by the time he did, he would have done the one thing no Meridian had ever done in 30,000 years. He would have walked away from the bloom and lived. The second entry was longer, and it was the kind of plane that made Aun's crest ache. Halden Brew wrote that the inside of Still Humming was the largest dead thing she had ever walked through, and that it did not feel dead. The corridors were 11 meters tall, too big for human hands, built by a species that had been larger and that had been gone a long time. The air was thin and cold, and tasted of old metal, and everywhere, in the deep walls, there was the hum, a vibration just under hearing, steady as a heartbeat, the sound of one core out of 100 refusing to go out. She wrote that her crew wanted to strip the easy decks and leave. There was enough rare alloy in the first kilometer alone to make all 6 of them rich for life. Sell the salvage, go home, never crawl through a dead hull again. That was the smart play. That was the safe play. Halden Brew made them stay. Awan read her reasoning 4 times, because it was so unlike the way the Meridian thought that he could not make it fit in his head. She did not stay because the ship was valuable. She stayed because the ship was hurt. That was the word she used. Not broken, hurt. She wrote that a hull this size, this old, this strange, had clearly been somebody's whole world once, and that somebody had loved it enough to build it 11 kilometers long and carve its name 100 meters tall, and then something had killed them all and left the ship alone in the dark with one light still on. And she could not strip a thing like that for parts and call it a day's work. She wrote, somebody has to find out what it was for. There had been an argument, Aun could tell, though the log only hinted at it. The man Oster had wanted to leave. He had a family on the frontier, and a debt to clear, and the easy salvage would clear it twice over. Pell had sided with Halden, because Pell was the one who had found the single burning core and could not stop thinking about it, about a machine that had kept one light on for 900 years, with no one to keep it company. The Vane brothers would do whatever Halden did, and Sib, the quiet one, had said the thing that ended the argument. He had said that if they stripped the ship and left, the ship would go dark, and the last light would go out, and there would be no one in the whole galaxy who knew it had ever been anything at all. Sib could not stand that. Neither, it turned out, could Halden Brew. So they stayed, 6 people in a beaten tug, around a ship the size of a mountain, with a hum in its deep walls that none of them could explain, and a choice made not for money, but for the simple human refusal to let a thing die alone if it could be helped. So they found out. It took them 4 years, and Aun followed every month of it through the stolen logs, and it changed the way he understood his own kind, slowly, the way water wears stone. The first year was learning. The humans did not assume they were smarter than the dead builders. They assumed they were dumber, and that the builders had known things they had to relearn. They traced the power lines. They mapped the cores. They found the great drive at the stern, a ring of dark engines 40 meters across, and they did not try to rip it out and replace it with human parts. They tried to understand why it had stopped, and when they understood, they wept, because it had not broken. It had been switched off. deliberately, from the inside, by a crew that had chosen to go dark rather than let the ship fall into something's hands. This was the thing Aun could not stop turning over. A Meridian salvager, finding a strange dead drive, would have torn it out and grown a Meridian one in its place, and counted the strange one as so much scrap. It would never have occurred to the rot to ask the dead machine why it had stopped, because the rot did not believe the dead had anything to say. The dead were food. That was all the dead had ever been, but the humans treated the dead builders as teachers and the dead ship as a patient, and they went slowly, deck by deck, learning the grammar of a vanished people because they assumed that grammar was wiser than their own. And they found things. In the first year alone, crawling through 11 kilometers of cold corridor, they found the marks of the last crew. They found a great hall near the prow where the builders had gathered, and on its walls, in the warding script, the last of them had written something. Halden Brew could not read it then, but she photographed every line of it, all of it, and she wrote in her log that whatever it said, it had been written by people who knew they were not coming back, and that you could feel that in the room even 900,000 years later, the particular stillness of a place where someone had said goodbye. She made the crew take their helmets off in that hall, even though the air was thin, just for a moment, out of respect. Aun read that, and did not understand it, and could not forget it. Aun knew, by then, whose hands. The script the humans could not read, the Meridian could. It was a warding script. A curse. The dead builders had met the rot too, 100,000 years before the Meridian were even an empire, and they had fought it, and they had lost their worlds, and the last of them had sealed their greatest warship and sent it into the dark, and switched it off, so the bloom could never have it. They had warded the hull so the rot could not eat it. That was why the Meridian seeds died on the skin. The ship was already a weapon against the rot. It had always been. It had simply been waiting 900,000 years for hands that would turn it back on. Halden Brew did not know any of that when she started. She only knew the ship was hurt, and that hurt things could be fixed, and that she was a person who fixed things. But Aun knew. He knew the warding script, the curse the humans could not read, and now he understood the room near the prow, the great hall where the last crew had said goodbye. He could read what they had written on its walls. It was not a prayer, and it was not a curse on their enemies. It was an apology and a hope, both at once. The last builders had written, in effect, that they were sorry to leave the ship alone, that they had no other choice, that the bloom was at their gates and the ship must never become part of it, and they had written a hope, the kind of hope you write when you have given up everything else. They had written that someday, somewhere hands would come that were not the hands of the hunger, and those hands would wake the ship, and the ship would finish the war the builders could not. Halden Brew had no idea she was the answer to a prayer 100,000 years old. She was just a worker who could not leave a hurt thing alone. But Aun, reading both the human log and the builder's walls, saw the two ends of the story reach across the dark and touch, and it was the first time in his 240 years that he had ever felt small in the right way, the way that makes room for something larger than yourself. The second year was the cores. There were 100 fusion cores in still humming, and 99 were cold, and the humans could not relight them with the alien controls, so they did something the Meridian would never have done. They did not force the ship to work the human way. They taught themselves to work the ship's way. Halden Brew spent 11 months learning to read a dead language from the inside out, matching symbol to function, function to result, until she could speak to the ship in its own tongue. And on the 341st day, she lit the second core. It was Pell who actually threw the sequence, Halden wrote, but it was the whole crew who had earned it. They had failed at it 40 times. 40 times they had fed power to a cold core and watched it refuse to catch, and 40 times they had gone back to the dead language and the dead diagrams and tried to learn what they had gotten wrong. The Meridian, Aun thought, would have given up after 3. The rot did not fail 40 times at anything. It simply ate the problem and moved on. But the humans treated each failure as a lesson the ship was teaching them, and on the 41st try, the second core caught and held, and the hum, which had been the lonely song of one light, became the song of two. Aun thought about that number, 41. more than once over the years that followed, because it kept coming back. 41 tries to light the second core. 41 hulls of the choir spared and sent home. He did not think the humans had noticed the echo. They were not the kind of people who kept score that way. But Aun, who had spent 240 years measuring things, could not help measuring it, and he found a strange comfort in it. The same patience that had relit a dead engine on the 41st try was the patience that had let 41 frightened ships flee instead of die. It was all one thing in them, the persistence and the mercy. They came from the same place. The Meridian had neither, because the Meridian only ate, and a thing that only eats does not need to be patient and does not know how to be merciful. Patience and mercy are for people who intend to still be here tomorrow, and to want tomorrow to be better than today. The Bloom had never wanted anything but more. Aun read that entry standing up. He did not know why he stood. The log just said, Core 2 online. Hum got louder, crew cheered, but there was something under the plain words, something that reached across 900,000 years, and 2 species, and it lifted him out of his cradle without his meaning to move. The hum got louder. The ship was waking up. By the end of the second year, 11 cores burned. By the end of the third, 60. The humans found that as the power came up, the ship began to help them. Doors that had been sealed slid open. Lights that had been dead came on in soft amber, one deck at a time, as if the ship were remembering how to see. And deep in the heart of it, behind a door that had taken them a year to open, they found the thing the builders had been protecting. The third year nearly killed them more than once. Aun read those entries with a clenched hand. A coolant line let go in the 82nd corridor, and Oster nearly drowned in a gas that froze on contact. The drive ring, when they first turned it, shook the whole hull so hard that Sib was thrown into a bulkhead and broke an arm, and they had no surgeon, so Halden set the bone herself by lamplight while the ship hummed around them. They lived on tinned food and recycled water, and the stubborn, unreasonable belief that the ship was worth it. They had long since passed the point where the salvage made sense. Any sane crew would have left a year before, but they had stopped thinking of it as salvage. Somewhere in the second year, without any of them saying so, they had started thinking of it as a rescue. You do not abandon a rescue halfway because it gets hard. You finish it, or you die trying. That was the human rule, and Aun had never in his life met anything like it. It was not a weapon, exactly. It was a mind. Not alive, not anymore. But a recorded mind, a copy of the ship's last commander, sealed in crystal and waiting, set to wake only when the ship was whole, and only for hands that had fixed it, instead of stealing it. The builders had thought of everything. They had known that whatever found their ship might be a scavenger, a thief, another rot. So they had set a test. Fix me, the test said. Heal me. Do not strip me, and I will give you everything. Halden Brew had passed the test without ever knowing it was there. She had passed it in the first year, when she chose to stay because the ship was hurt. The mind woke. The humans could not understand its speech, and it could not understand theirs, but it could see what they had done. It could see 900,000 years of damage repaired by 6 pairs of hands that had asked the ship how it wanted to be fixed instead of telling it. And the mind, in the only language they shared, which was the language of work, began to teach them what the ship truly was. Aun lingered on the entry where the mind first woke, because Halden Brew had written it carefully, the way you write the most important day of your life. She wrote that the crystal had been dark for as long as they had known it, a great smoky stone the size of a room, set behind a door warded so deeply that it had taken them a year of learning the dead language to open it without harming what lay inside. And when the 60th core caught and the power reached the crystal at last, it had not blazed to life. It had glowed, slowly, like an ember finding its breath, and a presence had filled the room that was not a voice, and not a face but a kind of attention, vast and old and unutterably tired, turning toward them for the first time in 900,000 years. Halden wrote that she had felt it look at her, not at her hands, not at her tools, at her, as if it were asking a question, and she had understood the question, somehow, without words, and she had answered it the only way she knew how. She had held up her scarred hands, palms open, and she had said the thing she said to every hurt machine she had ever met. She had said, "It's all right, we're here to help." The crystal had brightened, and the long teaching began. It taught them slowly, because it could only teach them through doing. The mind would light a panel and wait for them to understand. It would show them a flow of power and let them trace it. It taught them the way a patient teacher teaches a child a craft, not by telling, but by setting the work in front of them and letting their own hands learn the truth. And the humans, who were craftspeople to the bone, learned the way craftspeople learn, with their hands and their patience and their willingness to be wrong 40 times before they were right. The mind and the crew did not share a language for years. They shared something better. They shared work. And in the sharing, the ship came back to life around them. It was a warship, the greatest the builders had ever made. It had a weapon along its 11-kilometer spine that the humans had walked past 1,000 times and never recognized, because it did not look like a gun. It looked like a wound, a long dark scar down the hull, and it was a wound, in a way. It was a thing that made wounds in the deepest order of matter, a lance that did not burn or break but unmade, that reached into a thing and switched off the bonds that held it together, the way the builders had switched off their own cores rather than let the rot have them. A weapon built by a people who had learned, the hardest way there is, exactly how to kill a thing that healed. The builders had not started as warriors. The mind showed the humans that too, in images that needed no language. The builders had been a gentle, patient people, slow and large and fond of long thoughts, and they had built their first great ships to explore, not to fight. They had crossed the dark for 10,000 years before they ever met the rot, and when they met it they had not understood it, the way no one understood it at first, because it did not attack the way enemies attack. It arrived as a gift, or a trade, or a drifting seed on a piece of debris, and by the time you knew it was inside your world it was already too late. The builders had lost their first colony before they even knew they were at war. They had lost 100 more learning what war with the rot meant. And out of all that loss, slowly, with their gentle, patient hands, they had built the one thing that could end it. They had built still humming, and then they had run out of time. The meridian rot healed. The meridian rot ate damage and grew back stronger. But you cannot heal what has been switched off. You cannot regrow from a bond that no longer agrees to hold. The dead builders had made the perfect weapon against the rot, and then they had died before they could use it, and it had waited in the dark for 90,000 human lifetimes until a worker named Halden Brew climbed inside and decided to fix it. Aoun put the log down. His hands were not steady. He understood, now, why the reports had stopped coming back. He understood what the devouring choir had met out there in the dark, what the hollow wind had flown into. He understood that his empire, his 30,000-year empire of living gray, had been doomed the moment 6 tired humans decided not to take the easy salvage and go home. But understanding was not the same as believing, and Aoun still did not quite believe, so he read on. He read about the day the Meridian found them. It was the 4th year, and still humming was almost whole. 90 cores burned. The drive turned. The mind taught, and the humans learned. And Halden Brew's logs, which had been a worker's logs, dry and flat and full of part numbers, had begun, here and there, to sound like something else. She had stopped calling it the ship. She called it her by then. She wrote that she could feel it humming through the deck plates when she slept, and that the hum had changed, that it was no longer the lonely sound of one core refusing to go out. It was the sound of 100 cores remembering what they were for. Aoun read the 4th-year entries more slowly than any of the others, because they were where the worker stopped being a stranger to him and became, against all his will, someone he understood. She wrote about small things. She wrote that the ship had learned to warm the corridors she walked through and cool the ones she did not, anticipating her, the way an old friend hands you a tool before you ask. She wrote that the hum had a rhythm now, and that the rhythm changed with the work, urgent when there was danger, slow and deep when the crew slept, and that she had come to read the ship's mood from it, the way you read the breathing of someone you love. She wrote that Sib had started talking to the walls, and that none of them teased him for it, because they all did it now. The ship was no longer a wreck they were stripping, or even a patient they were healing. It had become, somehow, the seventh member of the crew, and the crew, who had come for salvage and stayed for a rescue, had ended up with a home. And then the scouts came back. Meridian scouts, on the hungry sweep, returning to a wreck they had logged as dead, finding it lit from prow to stern, 11 kilometers of amber light in the cold dark, humming. The scouts seeded it again. The seeds died again. And the scouts, frightened now, sent the signal that brought the devouring choir. Halden Brew's log for that day was 11 words long, and Aun would remember it for the rest of his life. It read, "Company's coming. She isn't a wreck anymore. Let's show them." Aun stopped and read that line 3 times. "Company's coming. She isn't a wreck anymore. Let's show them." There was no fear in it. There was something he had no Meridian word for, a kind of fierce and quiet gladness, the feeling of a person who has spent 4 years putting a broken thing back together and is about to find out, at last, what it was built to do. The humans were not afraid of the devouring choir. They were almost glad it was coming, because the ship had told them, through the mind in the crystal, exactly what it was, and they believed it, and now they were going to find out if the belief was true. 60 hulls of living gray, 60 ships that had eaten 11 civilizations, against 1 ship and 6 humans who fixed things for a living. The Meridian had done the math. It was not even a battle, by the math. It was a cleanup. The math was wrong. The math had always been wrong. The math did not know what the builders had built, or what the humans had healed, or that there is a kind of strength that does not come from eating the dead, but from refusing to let the dead be forgotten. Aun was about to learn the difference. So was the devouring choir. He turned to the battle, and his crest went flat against his skull, and he did not breathe for a long time. But before he read it, he sat for a while with a thing he had been avoiding. He went back and reread the entry from the night before the choir arrived, the one where Halden Brew had written down, in her plain flat hand, what she told her crew. They had not been certain they would win. That was the thing the Meridian could never have grasped. The Rot always knew it would win, right up until the 19 seconds in which it learned otherwise, and that certainty was its whole strength, and its whole sickness both. But the humans had gone into that night not knowing. The mind had told them what the ship was. They believed it, and still they did not know, because belief is not certainty, and a real thing tested for the first time can always fail. Halden had written what she said to them. She had not promised them victory. She had said, instead, that whatever happened, they had done a good thing in waking the ship, that a good thing done well is its own reward whether you live to enjoy it or not, and that she was proud of every one of them, and that if this was the last entry she ever wrote, she wanted it on the record that she had never in 20 years worked with a better crew. Aun read that and understood that this too was a kind of strength his people had never owned. The strength to do the right thing without the guarantee that it would pay. The bloom only ever did what was certain to feed it. The humans did what was right and let the dice fall. And the dice, it turned out, came up for the ones who deserved them. The devouring choir came in the formation the Meridian had used for 30,000 years. A wide gray crescent, 60 hulls spread to swallow whatever they surrounded. Aun had flown that formation himself in his younger days. He knew its strength. The crescent did not fight you. It enveloped you, and the seeds rained off its skin in their billions, and the bloom found your hull and ate it, and your ship became part of theirs while you watched. You did not die fighting the choir. You died becoming it. That was the terror of the Meridian, the thing that had made 11 civilizations kneel before a shot was fired. You could not beat a thing that turned your own ship against you. Still humming did not run from the crescent. It turned its prow toward the center of it. Aun had to remind himself, reading this, that there were only 6 people aboard. 6. A ship 11 kilometers long, a weapon that could unmake the unmakeable, and 6 pairs of human hands to run all of it. They had divided the ship between them by then. Halden held the heart, the great hall where the long note was fired. Pell ran the cores, all 60 of them, alone, moving through the deep decks like a single nerve keeping a giant alive. Auster held the drive. The Vane brothers ran the eyes and ears, the old builder sensors they had relearned how to read. And Sib kept the air and the water and the small impossible miracle of 6 warm bodies staying alive inside a frozen mountain. They could not have crewed a Meridian Dreadnought's galley with 6 people. They crewed the most powerful warship in the galaxy with them, because the ship met them halfway, because they had earned the right to be met halfway, and because there was no one else, and the work had to be done, and they were the kind of people who do the work that has to be done. Aun read the human log and the captured Meridian battle record side by side, the workers' flat words and the choir's panicked screaming, and together they told one story. The humans called it the longest hour of their lives. The choir called it the day the dead came back. The seeds hit still humming skin first, billions of them, the gray rain that had ended worlds, and the seeds died, every one. The builders' wards, 900,000 years old, still held, and the bloom could no more touch that black alloy than fire can touch water. The choir had never seen its seeds fail. For 9 seconds, the 60 hulls of the devouring choir simply hung there, doing the only thing they knew how to do, raining death on a hull that drank it like rain on stone. Then still humming fired. Halden Brew did not have a word for the weapon, so she called it the long note, because firing it made the whole ship hum down to a sound she could feel in her teeth. The Meridian record had a better view. It showed the dark scar along the 11-kilometer spine open like an eye, and from it came not a beam of light, not a shell, not anything that burned. It came a line of wrongness, a place where the order of matter simply stopped agreeing with itself. And where that line touched the lead hull of the devouring choir, the living gray did not burn and did not break. It switched off. Awon had to stop reading. He had seen many ships die. He had never seen one unbecome. The Meridian record showed it in pitiless detail. The lead hull of the choir, a ship that had eaten 4 worlds, that healed every wound, that grew back stronger from every blow, met the long note and forgot how to be a ship. The bonds that held its gray flesh together simply stopped holding. It did not explode. It came apart into dust, into the smallest pieces of itself, into a long gray smear in the cold that would never grow again, because you cannot regrow from a thing that has been told to stop existing. The choir had never lost a hull it could not regrow. It lost one in the first 9 seconds, and it screamed. The scream was real. Aun knew it from the records, the strange chorus cry the bloom made when many connected hulls felt one of them die in a way that could not be undone. The devouring choir was not 60 separate ships, not truly. It was 60 bodies of one connected thing, sharing a single deep awareness through the bloom that ran between them. And when the lead hull unbecame, all 60 felt it at once, felt a thing happen that the bloom had no answer for. A death without a wound, a loss without a body to regrow from. For 30,000 years the rot had been the thing that could not be permanently hurt, and in 9 seconds it learned, in its single shared mind, that there was now a thing in the galaxy that could permanently hurt it. The scream was the sound of that learning. Almun had heard it once before, faintly, in an old record from the early conquests, when some clever species had nearly found the trick and then been swallowed before they could perfect it. He had not understood then what the scream meant. He understood now. It was the bloom discovering it could be afraid. The crescent broke. The Meridian captains, 30,000 years certain that nothing could uneat them, watched the dead ship turn its eye on a second hull, and a third, and they did the thing the Meridian never did. They scattered. Aun read their own panicked orders, the ancient war tongue of his people gone shrill with disbelief, ships countermanding ships, the whole iron certainty of the bloom cracking in real time as hull after hull came apart into smears that would not heal. And here was the thing Aun could not look away from. The humans were not cruel. Halden Brew's log, in the middle of the longest hour of her life, with 60 hulls of the most feared weapon in the galaxy trying to dissolve her ship, stopped to make a note that mattered to no one but her. She wrote, "Most of them are running now. We could chase. We're not going to chase the ones that run. Still humming did not chase the ones that ran. It killed the hulls that kept raining seeds, the hulls that would not stop trying to eat it, and the moment a Meridian ship turned its prow away and fled, the long note let it go. Aun counted in the records. Of 60 hulls in the devouring choir, the humans unmade 19. The other 41 ran, and lived, and carried home the thing the Meridian had never had to carry before. They carried back fear. 19 of the most feared warships in the galaxy, dissolved by one dead hull and 6 people who fixed things for a living, and the humans did not even take a scratch, because the bloom could not touch the wards, because the builders had thought of everything 100,000 years before the Meridian were born. There was a moment in Halden Brew's log, near the end of that hour, that Aun could not get out of his head. She wrote that after the 19th hull came apart, and the last of the choir turned to flee, the great hall around her had gone very quiet, the long note silent, the hum dropped back to its slow, deep rhythm. And in that quiet, the mind in the crystal had done something it had never done before. It had shown her an image, not a diagram, not a panel of light, an image, a picture of a world, green and blue and turning, a world she had never seen, and around it, faint and far, the gray crescent of the rot closing in. And then the image had changed, and the crescent was gone, and the world still turned, green and blue and whole. The mind had no words. But Halden understood. The mind was showing her what the ship was for. Not killing, saving. The long note was not the point of the ship. The world that kept turning was the point. The weapon was only the price of the world. She wrote that night, "I get it now, we didn't fix a gun, we fixed a shield that happens to have teeth." Aun sat with that for a long time. Then he understood something that frightened him more than the weapon. The humans had not built the long note. They had not built the wards. They had inherited them from a dead people by being the kind of hands that fix instead of steal. The strength was not human strength. It was older than humans. But it had answered to humans, when it had refused to answer to the rot for 900,000 years, and Aun thought he understood why. The builders had set a test, and the test was not "Are you strong?" The test was "Will you heal a hurt thing that can never repay you?" The rot had failed that test every day for 30,000 years. The worker had passed it without trying. He read on. After the choir broke, the Meridian High Command did what the Meridian always did when something hurt them. They escalated. They could not believe a single hull had done this, so they decided it must be a trick, a one-time weapon, a flaw they could overwhelm with numbers. They sent the Hollow Wind. The Hollow Wind was not a warship. It was a plague, a single vast bloom hull, slower than the choir, almost defenseless in a normal fight, but carrying in its gray belly a strain of the rot, refined over 10,000 years to do one thing. It did not eat metal. It ate flesh, living flesh. It could seed a planet's air and turn every breathing thing on it to bloom in 9 days. Screaming. The Meridian had used it to break the worlds that would not break, the ones that fought too hard, the ones that needed to be made an example of. They sent it to still humming because they had decided the humans inside were the real weapon, and that if you could not kill the ship, you killed the crew. Aun did not want to read this part. He read it anyway. The Hollow Wind reached still humming 40 days after the choir broke, and it did the thing it was built to do. It seeded the space around the ship with the flesh strain, a cloud of gray death that could turn 6 humans to bloom faster than they could scream. And then it waited, the way a plague waits, certain that no hull is sealed forever, certain that sooner or later the humans would have to open a door, vent a chamber, take a breath of poisoned air. The humans did not panic. Aun read Halden Brew's log for that day, and it was the calmest entry in 4 years. She wrote that the ship had felt the cloud before they had, that the hum had changed again, gone low and watchful, and that the mind in the crystal had shown her something in the ship's deep design, that the builders had left for exactly this. The builders had fought the rot. Of course they had. They had not only built a weapon to unmake the bloom's hulls, they had built the ship to keep the bloom out of its air. Still humming did not vent. It did not open a door. Instead, deep in its 11 kilometers, it turned on something the humans had mapped in the first year and never understood, a system that ran the whole hull's air through the black alloy of the wards, again and again, and the wards killed the flesh strain the way they killed the seeds, the way they killed everything of the rot that touched them. The cloud of death hung outside the hull and could not get in, and inside, the 6 humans breathed clean air and kept working, and the hollow wind waited for a door that never opened. Aun understood the cruelty of what the Meridian had tried to do, and it shamed him in a way the Empire had never let him feel before. The hollow wind did not come to fight the ship. It came to murder the people inside the ship and leave the hull standing, a clean prize, 6 dead workers, and a weapon the Meridian could study at leisure. It was the oldest Meridian logic. If you cannot eat the shell, poison the meat. The High Command had looked at 6 human beings who had spent 4 years bringing a dead ship lovingly back to life, and they had seen only an obstacle to be dissolved. Aun had signed orders like that himself, long ago. He had not thought of the people inside the hulls. The Meridian never did. That was the whole of what was wrong with the Meridian, in the end. It had grown so large and so hungry that it had forgotten there were people inside the things it ate. It waited 11 days. Then still humming turned its prow toward it, and the long note opened its eye, and the plague ship that had ended 30 worlds came apart into a smear that would never bloom again, and the humans, Aun noted, did not gloat. Haldenbrew's log for that day was 4 words long, the same length as her first. It read, "That one had to go." Aun understood the difference. The 41 hulls of the choir that ran, she had let live, because running ships were just frightened ships, and frightened ships could learn. But the hollow wind did not run, and it did not fight, and it could not learn, because it was not a crew at all. It was a thing built only to make breathing things die screaming, and Halden Brew, who fixed things for a living, knew the one thing that cannot be fixed is a weapon whose only purpose is murder. So that one had to go. There was no cruelty in it, and no joy. There was only a worker doing the part of the job nobody wants to do. Aun set the log down and looked at the gray flesh of his own flagship, healing its wounds with brown dead lines, and for the first time in his long life he wondered if the bloom had ever been strength at all, or only a hunger that had learned to call itself strength. He had spent 30,000 years certain his people were the apex of the galaxy. He was beginning to understand that they were a sickness that had gotten very good at spreading, and that out there in the dark, a worker and a dead ship were the cure. He should have stopped reading then. A loyal shipwright would have. But Aun had stopped being only a loyal shipwright somewhere in the 2nd year, somewhere around the day they lit the 2nd core, and he could not stop now, because the Meridian had sent the choir and lost it, and sent the hollow wind and lost it, and Aun knew his empire, knew its pride, knew that it could not let this stand. He knew what came next. The Meridian was going to send everything, and he had to know if the worker and her dead ship would still be standing when the everything arrived. The Meridian sent the last hunger, and they emptied the dying empire to build it. Aun had been there when the order came down, though he had not understood it at the time. The High Command had gathered 11 of the largest bloom hulls in the fleet, and grown them together into one ship, a single gray monster 40 kilometers long, the biggest thing the rot had ever made. They had fed it 9 worlds to grow it, 9 living worlds, dissolved into the bloom, to make one ship large enough to swallow a hull 11 kilometers long. They called it the Last Hunger, and they meant the name as a boast, but Aun understood now that it had been a confession. It was the last of the Meridian's hunger, the final and largest swallowing, and into it, the dying empire had poured almost everything it had left. It was a desperate thing, the last hunger, though no Meridian would have said so. A healthy empire does not feed 9 worlds to one ship. A healthy empire does not need to. The Meridian built the last hunger because the bloom was failing, and they knew it, and they were terrified, and a terrified thing reaches for the biggest weapon it can make and tells itself that size is the same as strength. Size is not the same as strength. The worker knew that. The dead builders had known it. The Meridian were about to learn it. Aun had watched the last hunger grow, in the great growing orbit at the heart of the empire, and the memory shamed him now. He remembered the pride in the High Command's voices when they described it. 40 kilometers. A maw that could swallow a moon. The largest body the Bloom had ever worn. He remembered thinking, even then, with the part of him that was a shipwright and not just a believer, that there was something wrong with it. A ship should be built for a purpose. The Last Hunger had been built for a feeling. It had been built to make the Meridian feel large again, to drown the terror of the failing Bloom in sheer impossible size. He had said nothing. A shipwright who valued his life said nothing in those days. But he had known, in the quiet shipwright part of him that measured things honestly, that you do not feed 9 living worlds to one hull because you are strong. You do it because you are afraid, and you have mistaken your fear for ambition, and you are about to learn the difference in front of the whole galaxy. Halden Brew saw the Last Hunger coming for 9 days before it arrived, a gray smear on the long scanners that grew and grew until it filled them. Her log did not get afraid. Amun looked for the fear and could not find it. What he found instead was the worker's mind, turning the problem over, the way she had turned over a dead core or a sealed door, looking for how the thing worked so she could find where it would break. She wrote that the mind in the crystal had gone very quiet when the Last Hunger appeared, and then had shown her something. The builders, in their long war with the rot, had faced a thing like this before. They had faced the Bloom grown huge, grown into one body, and they had learned that a thing grown that large has a weakness a small thing does not. It is all one thing. The devouring choir had been 60 hulls, and when 19 died, the other 41 could run. But the Last Hunger was a single body, 40 kilometers of one connected Bloom, and a single body has a single heart. Find the heart, the mind told her, in the only language they shared, which was the language of how things are built. Find the place where the whole thing agrees to be one thing, and switch it off. Aoun read this, and felt his own heart stutter, because he knew where the heart of a grown-together hull was. Every shipwright did. It was the seed node, the original infection, the place where the first world had been dissolved, and from which all the rest had grown. It was buried at the very center of the Last Hunger, under 40 kilometers of gray flesh, the most protected point in the most enormous ship the rot had ever made. You could not reach it. Nothing could reach it. That was the whole point of growing a hull so large. The heart was untouchable. The long note did not need to touch it. The long note unmade bonds at a distance, reached into the deep order of matter and switched it off, and the only question was whether it could reach 40 kilometers deep through the densest Bloom the Meridian had ever grown. Halden Brew did not know. The mind did not know. No one had ever tried. So the worker did what workers do. She found out. In the 9 days before it came, she did not pace or pray or send out a last broadcast. She prepared the ship. Aoun read those entries with growing wonder. Pell ran every core to its limit and back, finding the exact threshold past which the long note could draw, building a margin she could spend in a single shot. Oster reworked the drive so the ship could hold itself dead still at the last instant. No drift, no wobble, because a shot that had to thread 40 kilometers of Bloom to a single heart could not afford a hand's width of error. The Vane brothers tuned the old builder sensors until they could see, faintly, the deep glow of the seed node through the gray flesh, the heart they would have to aim for. And Sib, who had nothing technical to do, cooked the crew the best meal he could make from what they had left, because he said that people facing a hard day should not face it hungry. They went into the worst hour of their lives, fed, rested, and ready, because the worker who led them understood that courage is not the absence of fear. It is preparation carried all the way to the edge of fear, and held there, steady, until the moment comes. The Last Hunger arrived, and it did not bother with seeds, because it had learned the seeds were useless. It came straight on, 40 kilometers of gray hunger, opening a maw at its prow large enough to take still humming whole, meaning to do the one thing the Meridian still believed it could do, which was to swallow the dead ship and make it part of the Bloom. It came on with the certainty of 30,000 years, the certainty that nothing could not be eaten, the last certainty the Meridian had left. Haldenbrew waited until the maw was close. Auen read the timing in her log and understood it slowly, the way you understand a thing that is braver than you would have been. She did not fire at range. She waited until the last hunger was almost on her, until the maw filled the sky, until the heart of it, the seed node 40 kilometers deep, was as close to her prow as it would ever be. She waited until the shot was as short as she could make it, and then she pointed Still Humming's 11-kilometer spine straight down the throat of the largest weapon the Rot had ever built, and she fired the long note into its open mouth. The line of wrongness went down the throat of the last hunger, and it did not stop at the surface, and it did not stop at 1 kilometer or 10 or 30. It went all the way down, through 40 kilometers of gray flesh, to the seed node, to the heart, to the place where the whole enormous body had agreed to be one thing, and it switched the agreement off. Auen had the meridian record of the last hunger's death, taken by the scout holes that had hung back to watch the kill, and it was the most terrible thing he had ever seen. The last hunger did not come apart at the edges. It came apart from the center. The heart unbecame, and the unbecoming raced outward through the connected body faster than the bloom could scream, and 40 kilometers of the Rot, 9 swallowed worlds, the last and largest hunger of a 30,000-year empire, dissolved from the inside into a cloud of dead gray dust that drifted in the cold and would never, ever grow again. It was over in 19 seconds. The biggest ship the galaxy had ever seen, killed in 19 seconds by a shot fired down its own throat, by a worker who had found the one place where size became weakness and switched it off. A hound replayed the record 100 times. He kept waiting for it to come out differently. He kept waiting for the bloom to do the thing the bloom always did, to heal, to regrow, to swallow the wound and come back stronger. It never did. The seed node was switched off, and a body cannot heal from a heart that no longer agrees to beat, and 40 kilometers of the most fearsome thing his empire had ever built came apart like ash in a wind. He had spent 240 years believing the bloom was eternal. He watched it end in 19 seconds, on a loop, alone in his cradle, until the believing finally bled out of him and something quieter and truer took its place. It was not grief exactly. It was the feeling of waking from a long fever and finding the room smaller and plainer and realer than the dreams had been. The bloom had never been eternal. Nothing built on hunger is eternal. It had only been very large for a very long time, and largeness had let it forget that it could die. The scout hulls fled. Auen read their final transmission, and it was not a battle report. It was a single word, sent over and over in the old war tongue, the word the Meridian used for the bloom itself, for the great gray strength at the heart of the Empire, and the scouts were sending it as a question now, as a thing that had stopped being true. Auen read that word repeated 40 times down the page, and he understood that he was reading the moment his empire stopped believing in itself. After the last hunger died, the Meridian did not send another fleet. There was no fleet left to send that mattered, not against a hull the bloom could not touch, and a weapon that killed the only thing the bloom could not survive. But more than that, Auen understood, the Meridian did not send another fleet because the will had gone out of it. You can lose ships and keep fighting. You cannot keep fighting once you have stopped believing you are strong. The bloom had been built on certainty, on 30,000 years of nothing can eat us, and the worker had taken that certainty and switched it off as surely as she switched off the last hunger's heart. Haldenbrew's log, the day after the last hunger died, was not a victory entry. Auen had expected a victory entry. Instead, she wrote about the 9 worlds. She had learned, somehow, from the mind in the crystal that could read the bloom, that the last hunger had been grown from 9 living worlds, and she wrote about them. She wrote that 9 worlds of people had been dissolved to make one ship to try to eat her, and that she had killed the ship, and that killing the ship did not bring the 9 worlds back, and that this was the part of the job nobody ever told you about. You could win, and it would still not be enough, because the dead stayed dead, and the only thing winning bought you was the chance that the 10th world might live. She wrote, "We don't do this so we win, we do this so they stop." And under that, in the same entry, she had added the 9 names, Not the names of the worlds, which she did not know, but names she had given them, one for each, the way she named everything she could not leave nameless. She had decided that 9 worlds dissolved into one ship to murder her would not pass out of the universe entirely uncounted, not while she had a hand to write with, and so she had invented 9 names and written them down and promised the empty page that someday, when the watch was over and there was time, she would find out the true ones and set them right. Aun, reading it, understood that this was the deepest difference of all. The Meridian unmade worlds and kept no record, because a record is a memory, and memory is a weight, and the bloom carried no weight it did not have to. The humans could not unmake even an enemy's 9 worlds without sitting down afterward, exhausted, and giving them names so that the loss would be a loss and not merely a number. He thought of his own empire's archives, vast and gray and full of tallies of the eaten, never once a name among them, and he felt something he had no Meridian word for, which the humans would have called shame. Aun read that line 11 times. It was the line that finished him as a Meridian. He had spent his whole life inside an empire that did things so it could win, so it could eat, so it could grow, and here was a worker from a frontier nobody had charted who did the hardest thing in the galaxy, for the simplest reason there is. So they stop. Not so I win, so they stop hurting the ones who cannot stop them. He thought of the brown deadlines in his flagship's healing flesh, the sickness no shipwright could cure, and he understood at last that the sickness was not in the bloom. The sickness was the bloom, and there was no curing it, because you cannot fix a thing whose whole nature is to eat. You can only switch it off. And then there was the entry that followed, the one Aun would carry to the end of his days. Halden Brew had written, 2 nights after the last hunger died, about a dream. She did not usually write about dreams, but she wrote that the mind in the crystal had shown her the builders again, the gentle, patient people who had made the ship, and that for the first time it had shown her how they died. Not in battle. The last of them had not died fighting. They had died waiting, on a quiet ship, with the bloom at their gates and no time left to use the weapon they had spent everything to build. They had run out of years, and before they switched the ship off and sent it into the dark, they had made one last recording in the crystal, a hope addressed to no one, to whoever might come. And the mind had finally translated it for her, now that she had earned the right to hear it. It said, "We could not finish. We are sorry. Finish it for us. Be better than the thing that beat us. Do not become it to defeat it." And Halden Brew, who had killed 19 hulls and the largest ship in the galaxy, and had never once chased a fleeing enemy, wrote underneath the translation a single line, an answer across 100,000 years to a people she would never meet. She wrote, "We'll try. We'll try to be better than it." That's the whole job, isn't it? That's the only job there ever was. He made his decision in the survey cradle, alone, with the stolen logs spread around him and his crest flat against his skull. He was a shipwright. He knew how the bloom worked better than almost anyone alive. He knew where its hearts were, and he knew, now, that the worker and her dead ship were not the enemy of the galaxy. They were the cure. So Aun Rasal, last great shipwright of the Meridian Rot, did the one thing no Meridian had done in 30,000 years. He chose to walk away from the bloom, and he chose to bring the worker something she did not have, because there was one more thing he knew that she did not, and it was the only gift he had left to give. Aun stole a courier and ran, and the running was the easiest thing he had ever done, which told him how long he had wanted to do it. He carried one thing the humans did not have. He carried the truth about the bloom's last secret, the thing the High Command guarded above all else, the reason the rot had been failing for 1,000 years. He knew where the first seed was, the original, the mother node, the oldest infection, the single buried heart from which every bloom hull in the whole Meridian fleet had ultimately grown, all of them connected back through 30,000 years of budding and dividing to one original gray seed, sleeping in a vault at the center of the Empire's oldest world. The Meridian did not know it themselves, most of them, but a great shipwright learns where the dead are buried. And Aun knew that if the mother node were ever switched off, every bloom hull in the fleet, all of them grown from it, all of them still faintly connected to it, would unbecome at once. The bloom was one thing. The worker had taught him that, killing the last hunger. The whole empire was one thing, grown from one heart, and it had one weakness, and it was the same weakness, and Aun Rasal carried the location of it in his head as he ran for the dead ship that hummed. He did not run blind. He knew what he was leaving. 240 years of belonging, of rank, of the only people and the only purpose he had ever known. He knew that if the High Command learned what he carried, they would feed 100 worlds to 100 hungers to catch him before he reached the humans. He knew that no Meridian had ever left the bloom and lived, that to leave the bloom was not like leaving a country, but like a cell leaving a body, an unthinkable thing, a thing the bloom itself had no concept for. And he knew, with the clear cold certainty that had come to him watching the last hunger die on a loop, that none of that mattered anymore. He had spent his whole long life inside a thing that ate, and he had finally seen, in the plain flat logs of a human worker, that there was another way to be, and that he wanted it more than he wanted his rank or his safety, or even, in the end, his own people's approval. He wanted to be the kind of hands that mend. It was very late in his life to learn that he could be, but it was not too late. That too the worker had taught him without ever knowing his name. Still humming let him approach. Aun had wondered if it would. He came in slow, with every weapon cold and his hull lit, and his courier broadcasting the one thing he hoped the humans would understand, which was the location of the mother node, sent in the open, a gift no enemy would ever give. The dead ship watched him come. The long note did not open its eye, and when his courier touched the great black hull, 11 kilometers of warded alloy that the bloom could not eat, a door slid open in the amber light, and Aun Rasal went aboard the thing that had killed his empire, and met the worker who had healed it. Halden Brew was smaller than he had expected, and older, and her hands were scarred from 20 years of fixing dead hulls. She did not point a weapon at him. She looked at him the way she must have looked at Still Humming on the first day, the way a person looks at a hurt thing to find out what it is for. They had no shared language at first, but the mind in the crystal could read the bloom, and Aun was of the bloom, and through the mind, slowly, over many days, the worker and the shipwright learned to speak. He gave her the mother node. He told her where it was, and what would happen if the long note touched it. He told her she could end the meridian rot forever in a single shot, that 30,000 years of the bloom would unbecome in an afternoon, every gray hull in the fleet dissolving at once, the whole sickness switched off at the root. He expected her to do it. He wanted her to do it. He had run across the dark to give her the means. Halden Brew did not do it. Aun did not understand, at first. He thought she did not believe him, or did not trust him, or did not grasp what he was offering. So he explained again, more carefully, sure she had missed it. One shot. The whole empire. Gone. The cure. Complete. She understood perfectly. That was why she would not do it. She explained it to him slowly, through the mind in the crystal, and Aun wrote it in his own log later, in the human script he had taught himself, because he wanted to remember it exactly. She told him that the mother node was at the center of the empire's oldest world, and that the oldest world was not empty. 30,000 years of the meridian lived there, not just the bloom, the people of the bloom, the ones grown alongside it, the young ones who had never eaten a world, the shipwrights and the clerks, and the ones who had never had a choice about being born into a sickness. If she switched off the mother node, the bloom would die, yes, but the world would die with it, and everyone on it, because the world was riddled with the rot, down to its roots, and the unbecoming would take it all. She would not buy the galaxy's safety with a whole living world, not even a world of her enemies, not even to end the thing that had fed 9 worlds to one ship to try to eat her. She told him something else, too, that he wrote down word for word. She told him that she had thought about it, really thought about it, the night after he gave her the location. She had sat in the great hall, with the long note silent around her, and she had let herself imagine doing it. One shot. The whole empire gone, every gray hull dissolving at once, the galaxy made safe forever, her watch ended, her crew free to go home. She admitted that she had wanted it. It would have been so easy, and it would have felt, for one shining hour, like justice. And then she had thought about the young ones on that world, the ones grown into a sickness they had never chosen, the ones who had never eaten a world and never would have been asked, and she had understood that the easy shot would not be justice. It would only be the bloom's own logic wearing her face. Erase everything that might threaten you. That was the Meridian Creed. And the moment she fired down the mother node to be safe forever, she would have become the very thing the dead builders had begged her not to become. She would have won the war by losing the only thing worth winning it for. Aun told her she was being foolish. He told her the Meridian would never stop, that mercy was a thing they did not have and did not understand, that they would rebuild and come again and feed more worlds to more hungers. He told her, in effect, the thing his whole empire had always believed, which was that the only way to be safe was to make sure nothing was left that could hurt you. Halden Brew heard him out. Then she gave him the answer that Aun Rasal carried for the rest of his long life, and it was the answer that explained everything, the dead ship and the long note, and the 41 hulls she had let run, and the 9 worlds she had grieved for. She said, "I don't fix things by destroying them. That's how I know I'm not you." And she told him what she would do instead. She would not switch off the mother node. She would do the harder thing, the slower thing, the thing that did not buy safety in an afternoon. She would take Still Humming to the edge of the Meridian's oldest world, 11 kilometers of warded alloy, and a weapon the bloom could not survive, and she would sit there, and she would wait, and she would be the wall. Every hull the Empire grew would have to come past her. Every hunger they built would have to face the long note. She would not end them. She would stop them, for as long as it took, for her whole life, if it came to that, and then she would teach someone else to fix the ship and stand the watch after her, the way the dead builders had left their ship for someone to find. Because the bloom was not really a thing you could kill. Aun knew that better than anyone. It was a hunger, and hunger does not die when you switch off a seed. It dies when there is nothing left to eat. And the only way to leave nothing for the hunger was to stand between it and every world it wanted, year after year, and refuse to move, and let the young ones of the Meridian grow up watching a wall they could not pass, until one generation of them, somewhere down the long years, grew up and asked the question Halden Brew had asked on the first day. Why are we doing this? Why are we eating worlds? What is the ship for? That was the cure. Not the mother node. The question. Aun argued with her for many days about whether it would work. He had 30,000 years of evidence that the bloom did not change, that hunger did not learn, that the young ones grew into the old creed as surely as a seed grows into a hull. Halden Brew heard all of it, and she did not argue back with theories. She argued back with herself. She said, "I was supposed to strip this ship and go home rich. Everyone I knew told me to. The smart money said leave, and I didn't, because it was hurt, and I couldn't. So don't tell me what people are supposed to do. People surprise you, even your people, especially your people. Somebody on that world is going to look up at a wall they can't get past, year after year, and instead of hating it, they're going to get curious. And curious is where it starts." She tapped her scarred chest when she said it. Aun wrote, as if the proof were standing right there in the room. And it was. He was looking at it. Because Aun Rasal himself was a Meridian who had grown up in the bloom and asked the question and changed, and his own existence aboard her ship was the argument he could not win. Aun stayed. He had nowhere else to go, and he found, to his surprise, that he did not want to be anywhere else. He became the 7th member of the crew that fixed things for a living, the old shipwright who knew where the dead were buried, and he taught the humans the deep secrets of the bloom so they could stand the watch better, and they taught him the thing he had never learned in 30,000 years, which was how to mend a thing instead of eating it. It changed him in ways he had not expected. The first time Still Humming took damage, a glancing strike from a desperate hunger that scored a furrow in the warded alloy, Aun's instinct was the bloom's instinct, to grow new flesh over the wound, to eat the damage. But the ship did not work that way. The humans repaired the furrow by hand, the way they did everything, cutting and shaping and fitting, and they let Aun help, and he found that mending a wound with his own hands, slowly, carefully, was a different thing entirely from eating it. When the bloom healed, it forgot the wound. When the humans mended, they remembered it. The furrow stayed visible under the patch, a faint scar in the black hull, and Halden said they left it that way on purpose, because a ship should remember what it has survived. Aun, who came from a people that grew new flesh precisely so they would never have to remember anything, stood for a long time looking at that scar, and understood that the difference between mending and eating was the whole difference between the humans and his empire, and that he had crossed over to the side of mending, and that he was glad. He learned the human craft slowly, with old hands that had only ever known the bloom. They taught him to read the grain of metal, to feel where a hull was strong and where it was tired, to make a join that would hold without devouring what it joined to. At first he was clumsy, and the humans were patient with him, the way they had been patient with the dead cores, and he understood that their patience was not a kindness they switched on for him. It was simply how they were with everything they meant to keep. And one day, years in, he finished a repair alone, a small one, a bracket reset and a plate refitted by his own hand, and Pell looked at it and nodded and said it was good work, and Aun Rasal, last shipwright of the Meridian Rot, who had grown 10,000 hulls from 10,000 drowned worlds, felt a pride he had never once felt in 240 years of growing, because he had not taken anything to make it. He had only mended what was already there. It was the smallest thing he had ever built, and it was the first thing he had ever built that had cost no one a world. The Meridian Rot came again, of course. The worker had known they would. They grew new hungers, and sent them to break the wall, and the wall did not break, because you cannot eat a hull the bloom cannot touch, and you cannot survive the long note, and still humming sat at the edge of the oldest world and turned back every hunger the dying empire could grow. And year by year the empire grew weaker, because it could not feed, because the worker stood between it and the worlds it needed, and a hunger that cannot feed grows quiet at last. There were quiet years too, between the hungers, and those were the years Aun came to treasure most. The wall did not only fight. Most of the time it simply waited, and waiting, it turned out, was a kind of living. The crew aged at the edge of the oldest world. Oster's family came at last, brought across the dark on a supply run, and still humming, which had been a tomb when they found it, learned the sound of children running in its 11-meter corridors. Pell grew old beside her 60 cores, and trained 2 others to tend them. Sib kept the air and the water for the rest of his life, and died in his sleep one quiet shift, and they buried him in the great hall near the prow, in the room where the dead builders had said goodbye, because Halden said he belonged with the people who had loved the ship enough to die for it. Aun helped carry him. It was the first funeral he had ever attended in his long life. The Meridian did not bury their dead. They ate them, and grew new flesh, and forgot. Standing in the hall of the builders, helping lay a quiet human in the dark, Aun finally understood what his people had given up when they chose to forget. They had given up the dead, and a people who give up their dead give up the only thing that ever teaches the living to be better. It took a long time. Halden Brew did not live to see the end of it. Aun outlived her, the way the old of his kind outlived the short-burning humans, and he stood at the long window of still humming the day they took her into the dark, and he watched the worker who had healed a dead empire and refused to murder a living one go out among the stars she had stood the watch for. He had brought her the means to end the Meridian in an afternoon, and she had handed it back, and chosen instead to spend her whole life being a wall, and Aun understood at last that this was the strength the dead builders had built their ship to find. Not the long note, not the wards, the hands that would heal a hurt thing that could never repay them and then refuse to become the thing that hurt it. Her last words to him were not grand. He had wanted them to be grand. He had expected, after a life like hers, some final wisdom to carry. But Halden Brew was a worker to the end, and what she said, with the ship humming around her and her scarred hands gone still at last, was simply this. She said, "Keep her humming." That was all. Keep her humming. The work outlives the worker, and the ship outlives them both, and the only thing she asked of the universe at the end of an extraordinary life was that the thing she had healed should go on being whole. Aun promised. He kept the promise. He spent what remained of his own long years making sure that the hum never stopped. The young human Halden Brew had trained, took the watch after her, and after that one, another. Aoun lived long enough to see the third keeper of still humming, and to see, on the oldest world of the Meridian, the first generation of the bloom that grew up asking why. He saw the gray hulls stop coming. He saw the hunger go quiet. He did not see the very end, because even his long life ran out at last, but he died certain of it, the way you are certain of a sunrise you will not be awake for. He had seen the beginning of the end, though, and that was enough. It came as Halden had promised it would, not with a battle but with a signal. One day, after a long quiet, a small craft lifted from the oldest world, alone, unarmed, lights showing, and came toward the wall. The keepers held the long note cold and waited. The craft was crewed by young Meridian, the grown alongside ones, the ones who had never eaten a world. They did not come to fight, they came to ask. They had grown up in the shadow of a wall they could not pass, and they had done the thing Halden Brew had bet 100,000 years of evidence they would do. They had gotten curious. They wanted to know who stood the watch, and why, and what the ship was, and whether it was true, the old forbidden rumor, that the hull on the edge of their sky could not be eaten because it had been built by a gentler people to end the hunger their elders called strength. Aoun met them. He was very old by then. He told them everything, and he watched their faces as they learned that the wall was not their enemy but their cure. And he knew, in that moment, that the worker had been right, and the bloom had been wrong, and that the slow, patient mercy of one human life had reached down 30,000 years of hunger, and finally, gently, begun to switch it off. And in the deepest archive of the dead builder's ship, where the mind in the crystal kept its records, there is a log written in the careful hand of an old alien shipwright who learned the human script late in life. It tells the whole story, the dead ship singing in the dark, the worker who fixed it, the choir and the hollow wind, and the last hunger that fed on 9 worlds and died in 19 seconds, the mother node she would not touch, the wall she chose to be instead. And it ends with the line Aoun Rasal wanted the galaxy to remember, the truth he had crossed the dark to learn and stayed to keep. He wrote, "They did not turn a failing ship into the strongest warship in the galaxy by making it cruel. They did it by making it whole." The bloom thought strength was hunger. The worker knew strength was the thing that stands between the hunger and the helpless and does not move. I was wrong for 30,000 years. She was right for one human life. And one human life of being right was enough to outlast my whole empire. The ship still hums. It hums at the edge of a world that no longer eats worlds, watched over by keepers who fix things for a living, warded against a hunger that has finally gone quiet. And on its prow, 100 meters tall, beside the dead builder's warding script, the humans long ago carved a second name in their own plain hand, the name they gave it the day they decided not to take the easy salvage and go home. Still humming, still humming, still here,